In 1969, an executive at Brown and Williamson, one of the largest tobacco companies in the United States, sat down and wrote a memo. It was a planning document, internal, not intended for public consumption. Just a man at a desk, writing a strategy memo for his colleagues about how the company should handle a problem. The problem, in this memo, is described with refreshing candor. The problem is that an enormous and growing body of scientific evidence, peer-reviewed studies, epidemiological data, animal experiments, clinical observations has established, with a degree of certainty that the scientific community considers essentially conclusive, that cigarettes cause lung cancer, and heart disease, and emphysema, and a collection of other conditions that, taken together, make smoking one of the leading causes of preventable death in the United States. The executive knew this. His company knew this. Their own research teams had been telling them this for years. The science, in other words, was not in dispute within the walls of Brown and Williamson. It was the settled, privately acknowledged reality on which the company was operating. Memo describes what to do about it, and the answer, in its elegant simplicity, is this: the company should manufacture doubt, not refute the science, not commission better research that might produce different results, not engage in good faith with the evidence. Manufacture doubt. Make the public feel that, where there is, in fact, scientific consensus, there is instead a legitimate scientific controversy. Make the question, does smoking cause cancer, feel unresolved, not because it is unresolved, but because the industry can benefit from making it feel unresolved. Confusion, the executive understood, was a product, just as much as cigarettes were a product, and confusion could be manufactured with far less overhead. He wrote it down. He wrote it in a memo, and the memo said, in language so clear it has been quoted in academic papers, congressional testimony, and courtrooms on 4 continents for the last 50 years, doubt is our product. Since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the mind of the general public, it is also the means of establishing a controversy. That sentence, doubt is our product, is one of the most honest things a corporation has ever written about itself. It is a mission statement. It is a confession. It describes, with complete precision, the thing that the American tobacco industry spent approximately 45 years and billions of dollars doing to the American public. They sold doubt. They sold it in full-page newspaper ads. They sold it through a research institute they funded and controlled and staffed with scientists whose job was to produce results that created the impression of controversy. They sold it through PR campaigns, through lobbying, through the careful cultivation of journalists who were happy to treat the debate over smoking and health as though it were a genuine scientific debate rather than a manufactured one. They sold it so effectively, for so long, that by the time the full scale of the operation became undeniable when the internal documents were finally leaked, finally produced in discovery, finally published and read and understood, somewhere between 100 million and 150 million people worldwide had died from tobacco-related illness. 100 million people, give or take. The accounting is imprecise, because mortality statistics covering the entire second half of the 20th century, across every country where American tobacco was sold, in every demographic group, with every confounding variable accounted for, do not resolve to a clean number. The World Health Organization's estimate is that tobacco killed 100 million people in the 20th century. Other estimates go higher. This is not a rounding error. This is not collateral damage. This is the direct, documented, foreseeable consequence of a decision made in boardrooms, and written down in memos to tell the public something that the people writing the memos knew was not true. The memo from 1969 is not the beginning of this story. It is the middle of it. The beginning, the moment when the industry looked at the science and made the decision to fight it rather than acknowledge it as 16 years earlier. December 1953. A hotel in New York. A meeting that changed the history of public health. Let's start with something that tends to get lost in the larger story. The science that established the link between smoking and lung cancer was not controversial. Not among scientists. Not by the early 1950s. By 1953. The evidence was already substantial, not definitive in the sense that every conceivable alternative had been ruled out, but substantial in the sense that multiple independent research teams, using different methodologies, in different countries, studying different populations, had all arrived at the same conclusion. Cigarette smoke causes lung cancer. The consistency of the finding across different studies, different populations, different research designs was, by the standards of mid-century epidemiology, remarkable. This was not a maverick hypothesis. This was an emerging consensus. The story of how that consensus developed is worth telling in detail, because understanding what the science actually said and when is essential to understanding what the tobacco industry did with it. The connection between tobacco and disease had been observed in medical literature going back centuries. German researchers in the early 20th century had noted elevated rates of lung cancer among smokers. But the decisive modern evidence begins in the late 1940s and early 1950s, when a new generation of epidemiologists started applying rigorous statistical methods to the question. The two most important early studies were conducted independently and almost simultaneously by researchers in Britain and the United States. In Britain, the epidemiologists Richard Dahl and Bradford Hill began in 1948 a systematic investigation of lung cancer patients in London hospitals. They interviewed 709 lung cancer patients and a control group of patients with other conditions, asking about smoking habits, occupation, place of residence, and a range of other potential factors. The results, published in the British Medical Journal in 1950, were unambiguous. There was a strong, consistent, statistically significant association between cigarette smoking and lung cancer. The more you smoked, the higher your risk. The longer you had smoked, the higher your risk. The relationship was, in epidemiological terms, a dose-response relationship, the kind of pattern that indicates causation rather than coincidence. In the United States, Ernst Winder and Evarts Graham published, in the same year, a study of 605 lung cancer patients and 780 controls. The findings were consistent with Dahl and Hill. Heavy smokers had dramatically elevated rates of lung cancer compared to non-smokers. And then, in 1953, Winder did something that moved the evidence beyond epidemiology into direct experimental demonstration. He painted tobacco tar onto the shaved backs of mice. Repeatedly, over an extended period, the mice developed malignant skin tumors. This was not ambiguous. You could see it. The tobacco tar caused cancer in living tissue under controlled experimental conditions. It was the kind of evidence that, in a world without enormous financial incentives to disbelieve it, would have been considered confirmatory. By December 1953, the scientific literature contained multiple independent epidemiological studies, all pointing in the same direction, plus an experimental animal study demonstrating the carcinogenic properties of tobacco products directly. Dahl and Hill would go on to publish, in 1954, The results of a prospective study of British doctors. The British doctors' study, which would follow 40,000 physicians over decades and produce some of the most comprehensive evidence on tobacco and mortality ever compiled. Richard Dole, who lived to the age of 92, gave up smoking after seeing his own early data. That is worth dwelling on for a moment. The man who conducted the research gave up smoking because the research was convincing. He was a scientist. He looked at the evidence and changed his behavior accordingly. This is, broadly, how science is supposed to work. The tobacco industry read the same evidence and did something different. The specific moment when the industry shifted from individual, ad hoc responses to a unified, coordinated strategy is well documented. It was the December 1953 issue of Reader's Digest. Reader's Digest, in the early 1950s, was the most widely read magazine in America. It was not a specialist publication. It was not read by scientists or policy experts. It was read by everyone: housewives, factory workers, farmers, businessmen, the ordinary cross-section of mid-century American life that bought it at drugstores and kept it in waiting rooms, and read it, cover to cover, on Sunday afternoons. Its December 1952 issue featured an article titled "Cancer by the Carton." The article summarized, in plain language, the accumulating scientific evidence linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer, and people read it. Cigarette sales, which had been climbing steadily in the post-war boom, dropped, not catastrophically but noticeably, measurably, and in a way that the industry's financial analysts noticed immediately. The health scare, as the internal industry documents would later call it, and was affecting the bottom line. Stock prices dipped. Market research showed increased anxiety among smokers about the health implications of their habit. This was the moment that triggered the December 1953 meeting. On December 15, 1953, Paul Hahn, the president of the American Tobacco Company and the man who organized what was about to happen, invited the chief executives of the 6 largest tobacco companies in the United States to meet at the Plaza Hotel in New York City. The Plaza was, at the time, one of the most prestigious addresses in Manhattan. The hotel, where business was done at the highest levels of American corporate life. Hahn chose it deliberately. This was not a backroom meeting. This was an industry summit. The companies represented at the table were American Tobacco, R.J. Reynolds, Philip Morris, Benson and Hedges, U.S. Tobacco, and Brown and Williamson. Between them, they controlled the overwhelming majority of the American cigarette market. Between them, they had the financial resources, the distribution networks, the advertising relationships, and the political connections to mount a response to the scientific evidence that no single company could mount alone. They had also, before the meeting, engaged the services of John W. Hill. John V. Hill was the founder and president of Hill & Knowlton at the time, one of the most powerful public relations firms in the United States. Hill had built his firm on the principle that any problem, if properly framed, could be managed. He had worked with industries facing health-related controversies before the chemical industry, the liquor industry. He understood the specific challenge of managing public perception of a product that evidence suggested might be harmful. He had, notably, stopped smoking himself in the 1940s. For health reasons, he knew what he knew. He also knew, professionally, that what he knew was not necessarily relevant to the service he was being hired to provide. Hill's analysis of the tobacco industry situation was shrewd and, in its way, sophisticated. He understood that the industry could not simply deny the science by asserting that it was wrong. The scientists conducting the research were credible. The journals publishing it were respected. A simple denial the science is bad, trust us instead would not work. Because the industry had no scientific credibility to offer as an alternative. They were cigarette companies, not universities. What they could do, Hill argued, I was attacked the certainty of the science rather than the science itself. They could argue not that the evidence was fake, but that it was incomplete, that more research was needed, that causation had not been definitively established, that other factors might explain the observed correlations, that the scientific community was divided, even if it wasn't, that the question was open, even if it wasn't. In other words, they could manufacture the appearance of a scientific controversy where none existed. The mechanism Hill proposed for doing this was elegant in its cynicism. The industry would create an independent research organization funded by the tobacco companies, but presented to the public as an independent scientific body that would commission research, award grants to scientists, and produce a steady stream of statements suggesting that the relationship between smoking and cancer was more uncertain than the existing literature indicated. The organization would have the trappings of scientific credibility, a prestigious name, an advisory board of recognizable academic figures, official-looking publications, while serving, in its actual function, as a propaganda apparatus. In its first year of operation, 1954, this organization would spend $948. Of that amount, less than 10%, $80,000 would go to actual scientific research. The rest went to Hill and Knowlton for PR services, to advertising, and to administrative costs. The organization spent roughly 10 times as much on managing its public image as on the science it claimed to exist to produce. This is not a subtle figure. 10% on science, 90% on propaganda, and yet it was presented to the American public in full-page advertisements in over 400 newspapers as an earnest commitment to understanding the relationship between smoking and health. The first thing that came out of the Plaza Hotel meeting was a name: the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. The Turk, housed one floor below Hill and Knowlton's own offices in the Empire State Building, run not by scientists but by the PR firm that had designed it. Staffed, in its advisory capacity, with academics who understood or came to understand what kind of research the organization was actually interested in producing. The second thing that came out of the Plaza Hotel meeting was the most consequential advertisement in American corporate history. On January 4, 1954, 3 weeks after the Plaza Hotel meeting, a full-page advertisement appeared in 448 American newspapers across 258 cities. The advertisement reached, by contemporary estimates, approximately 43 million people. It was titled, A Frank Statement to Cigarette Smokers. The frank statement is worth reading carefully, because it is a masterpiece of a very specific kind of communication. It is not lying, exactly not in the sense of making statements that are straightforwardly false. It is doing something more sophisticated. It is using the language of responsibility and concern to create impressions that are the opposite of responsible or concerned. It is performing candor while concealing the most important things. The statement opened by acknowledging the public's concern. Recent reports on experiments with mice have given wide publicity to a theory that cigarette smoking is in some way linked to lung cancer in human beings. It noted that the industry took this seriously and had deep concern. It expressed sympathy for smokers who were understandably worried. Then it pivoted. We believe the products we make are not injurious to health. And it listed reasons to doubt the existing science that lung cancer had many possible causes, that the evidence was statistical rather than experimental, that no conclusive proof existed. And then, the beautiful move, it announced the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. With its promise of independent research, its scientists of unimpeachable integrity, its advisory board of distinguished men from medicine, science, and education. The industry was not hiding from the question. It was taking responsibility. It was funding research. It was part of the solution. A Philip Morris executive, reflecting privately on the Turk in a memo later discovered in legal proceedings, described it with considerably less idealism than the Frank statement had projected. He wrote that it had been set up as an industry shield. The shield was not there to protect the public. It was there to protect the companies. The Frank statement is not remembered today primarily as an advertisement. It is remembered as the founding document of an industry strategy, the strategy of manufacturing scientific doubt that would be replicated over the following decades by industries facing inconvenient scientific evidence about the products they sold. The oil industry would use the same strategy to create doubt about climate science. The chemical industry would use it to create doubt about the health effects of specific compounds. The pharmaceutical industry would use it in specific contexts to create doubt about the side effects of specific drugs. The tobacco industry did not invent the concept of lying to the public, but it did something that has arguably been more consequential. It developed, refined, and documented in memos and strategy papers that would eventually become public record, a systematic methodology for manufacturing the appearance of scientific uncertainty, a playbook, a replicable set of tactics that any industry facing inconvenient science could adopt. The 1969 Brown and Williamson memo that opened this episode, Doubt is Our Product, was not describing an improvised response to a crisis. It was describing a mature, well-funded, professionally managed operation that had been running for 15 years. An operation that was 1969 quite good at what it did. How good? Between 1954, when the Frank statement was published, and cigarette sales had been dipping slightly from the health scare, and 1961, 7 years later, after the Turk had been operating. After the Frank statement had done its work, the number of cigarettes sold annually in the United States rose from 369 billion to 488 billion. Annual per capita consumption rose from 344 cigarettes per person per year to 4. Lingarwu. People were smoking more. After everything that had been published. After Dole and Hill. After Windows Mice. After the Reader's Digest. After the accumulating epidemiological evidence that was, among scientists, becoming essentially uncontroversial. They were smoking more because they had been told, in the most authoritative and pervasive way that a well-funded PR operation could manage, that the science was uncertain, that more research was needed, that the experts disagreed, that it was too early to worry. None of this was true. All of it was effective. The men who designed it, Hill, Hahn, their colleagues at the other tobacco companies, were not stupid. They were not ignorant of the science. They had access to the same studies that Dahl and Hill were publishing. They had their own internal researchers who were telling them the same things. A.J. Reynolds' researcher named Claude Teague had reviewed the epidemiological studies in February 1953 before the Plaza Hotel meeting and concluded in an internal report that the statistical association between smoking and cancer was real, and that the most probable explanation was a direct causal relationship. This was a Reynolds employee, writing in 1953, before the industry had fully committed to the strategy of denial. His report was internal. It stayed internal. It was not shared with the public, with regulators, with anyone outside the company. It was filed, and it stayed filed. And the company continued publicly to insist that the science was uncertain. This is the core of what happened. Not that the tobacco industry failed to understand the science. Not that they were confused by conflicting evidence. They understood the science. Their own scientists were telling them the science was clear. They made a deliberate decision to tell the public otherwise, and to build an organization, fund a strategy, and manage a decades-long campaign specifically designed to keep the public uncertain about something that the people running the campaign were not uncertain about at all. They knew. They chose. That choice killed people. Specific. Identifiable. Preventable deaths, people who continued smoking because they had been told the evidence was inconclusive, who developed lung cancer or heart disease or emphysema in the years and decades that followed, who might have quit if they had been told what the industry's own researchers were telling the industry in private. We'll talk about how many people that is and what the internal documents eventually showed in the chapters that follow, but before we get to the scale of what happened, we need to understand the machine more fully, because the Plaza Hotel meeting and the Frank statement were only the beginning. Let us talk about the Tobacco Industry Research Committee. Not about what it claimed to be, about what it actually was. The Turk-occupied offices in the Empire State Building in New York City. Prestigious address. Reassuring stationery. Its name, carefully chosen, combined three of the most legitimacy-conferring nouns in the American institutional lexicon: research, committee, and the implicit claim contained in the word industry that this was not a fringe operation but the organized response of a serious sector of the economy. Its stated mission was to fund independent scientific research into the relationship between tobacco and health, and to ensure that the American public received accurate, balanced, up-to-date information on the subject. Its actual mission, understood by everyone involved in its creation, was to make sure that the American public remained uncertain about a subject on which, among genuine scientists, certainty was rapidly accumulating. These two missions were in direct, irreconcilable conflict. The Turks' management resolved this conflict by pursuing the second mission with remarkable efficiency, while performing the first mission well enough to maintain the appearance of credibility. Here is the clearest single piece of evidence for what the Turk actually was: its budget. In its first full year of operation in 1954, the Turk spent a total of $948. This sounds, in mid-century dollars, like a serious commitment to scientific research. And indeed, of that $948, approximately one quarter went to Hill and Knowlton for public relations services. Approximately another quarter went to advertising, the placement of materials in newspapers and other media. Most of the remainder went to administrative costs, staff, offices, the overhead of running an organization, and scientific research, actual grants to actual researchers conducting actual studies, $80,000. Less than 10%. In 9,954. The year the tobacco industry announced to the American public, in 448 newspapers, that it was committing to earnest scientific research into the smoking health question. It spent less than 10 cents of every dollar it allocated to this stated purpose on the research itself. The rest went to managing the public perception of the research. This is not a footnote. This is the business model. The Turk maintained, to be fair, a genuinely impressive library operation. It employed staff whose job it was to monitor the scientific literature continuously to identify and index every study in every relevant journal that touched on tobacco and health. By its own accounting, the Turk's Literature Retrieval Division tracked publications from approximately 500 medical journals. It clipped articles. It filed them. It cross-referenced them. It produced for the tobacco companies. A comprehensive, up-to-date picture of exactly what the scientific community was finding out about their products. This is, when you think about it, a remarkable irony. The institute that the tobacco industry created specifically to cast doubt on the link between cigarettes and disease was, simultaneously, one of the most thorough monitors of the scientific evidence establishing that link. The people running the doubt operation knew, in exhaustive and current detail, exactly what the science said. They had to know. You cannot effectively argue that a body of evidence is uncertain if you don't know precisely what the body of evidence contains. The intelligence operation, the literature monitoring served the propaganda operation. They were not separate activities. They were one activity. Now, who was running this operation? The public face of the Turk was a distinguished scientist named Clarence Cook Little, a cancer researcher with impeccable academic credentials. Formerly the president of the University of Michigan and the University of Maine, the director of the Roscoe B. Jackson Memorial Laboratory in Bar Harbor, a nationally recognized figure in the biological sciences. When the frank statement announced that the Turk would be led by a scientist of unimpeachable integrity and national repute, Little was the man they had in mind. Little was 70 years old when he took the job. He was also, it would later emerge, a committed eugenicist. A fact that does not bear directly on the tobacco story, but does provide useful context for understanding the kind of moral calculus he was applying to his new role. He was, in any case, the Turk's public scientific figurehead. He was the name on the letterhead. He was the man quoted in the press releases. The man who actually ran the Turk's day-to-day operations, who made the decisions about what research got funded and what research didn't, was a research director named Robert Hockett, who had come, interestingly, from the Sugar Research Foundation, which had itself been doing closely analogous work, managing the scientific narrative around another consumer product facing inconvenient health research. Hockett, according to sources who later documented the organization's history, developed what observers described as a substantial reputation in the industry as a first-class controller of scientists. That phrase, controller of scientists, deserves to sit in silence for a moment. It describes, without apparent irony, the actual function of a man who was publicly presented as facilitating independent research. His job was not to support science. His job was to manage it. The structure through which this management operated had two tiers, and understanding both tiers is essential to understanding how the whole operation worked. The first tier was the public-facing grant program, the Turk, and later its successor organization, the Council for Tobacco Research, awarded research grants to scientists at universities and research institutions. These grants were screened by a scientific advisory board made up of legitimate academics. The grants produced real scientific work, some of which was published in real journals. This tier provided the appearance of independence and the reality of a scientific imprimatur. When a scientist who had received a CTR grant published research suggesting that the smoking cancer link was more uncertain than it appeared, the industry could point to the grant as evidence that it had funded independent research and was simply reporting what independent science had found. The selection process for these grants was, however, not neutral. A 1,978 internal memo from an American tobacco company executive, recovered in subsequent litigation, stated explicitly that the CTR must be more politically oriented and must find skeptical scientists. The advisory board was composed of scientists who, in various ways, had demonstrated a prior disposition towards skepticism about the cancer link, not because they were frauds, necessarily, but because the system was designed to ensure that the science it funded was the science most likely to produce useful doubt. You don't need to rig the results if you carefully select who's doing the experiments. But the more important tier, the one that reveals most clearly what the operation was actually for, was the second one. The special projects. The CTR special projects were, in the dry language of the legal documents that eventually exposed them, a separate category of research projects funded by CTR. Unlike the regular grant program, special projects were not screened by the Scientific Advisory Board. They were not reviewed by any independent body. They were not, in most cases, the product of any genuine scientific initiative. They were lawyer projects. The CTR special projects were directed by the general counsels, the chief legal officers of Philip Morris, Otto Uzel, J. Reynolds, Lori Lart, Leggett, Brown and Williamson, and American Tobacco, in consultation with attorneys from outside law firms including Jacob Benn, Madinger, Finnegan and Shook, Hardy and Bacon. These were not scientists making decisions about scientific research. These were lawyers making decisions about what research to fund, based on what results would be most useful in litigation. The purpose of the special projects is stated plainly in the legal proceedings that eventually exposed them. They were specifically commissioned for possible use in litigation. They were designed to produce scientific-looking ammunition for the industry's legal defense papers and statements by researchers whose work could be presented in court as evidence that the science was genuinely uncertain. One of the mechanisms that made this system particularly effective was that special projects funding was processed in ways that allowed the industry to invoke attorney-client privilege over the arrangements. This meant that the documents describing which projects were being funded, why, and by whom could not be obtained through ordinary legal discovery. The secrecy was not incidental. It was designed in. The lawyers who ran the special projects had specifically arranged the accounting procedures to create a legal shield around the nature of the operation. From 1966 through October 1990, a period of 24 years payments to the CTR's Special Projects Fund totaled $18. Over $18 million. Distributed through a system specifically designed to ensure that the relationship between the funding and its legal purpose would be invisible to anyone trying to understand what the CTR actually did. W 1984, the tobacco industry was publicly claiming that it had spent $120 million on research on smoking and health more. It proudly noted than the combined spending of the American Cancer Society, the American Lung Association, and the American Heart Association. It presented this as evidence of serious scientific commitment. It did not present the ratio of actual scientific research to PR operations, or the role of lawyers in directing what the research investigated, or the special project system through which the most useful results were quietly produced for courtroom use. The legal system was not, at this point, presenting opportunities to examine the details. The tobacco industry had spent considerable effort ensuring that it would not. Judge Gladys Kessler, who presided over the landmark federal racketeering case against the tobacco companies, United States Vice Philip Morris, decided in 2006, summarized the role of the industry's lawyers in this operation in terms that pull no punches. She found that lawyers directed scientists as to what research they should and should not undertake. They vetted scientific research papers and reports, as well as public relations materials, to ensure that the interests of the enterprise would be protected. They subsidized friendly scientific researchers with grants from CTR, and they devised and carried out document destruction policies and took shelter behind baseless assertions of the attorney-client privilege. The judge was not describing isolated instances of misconduct. She was describing a systematic, decades-long operation that she characterized with the full weight of a federal court ruling as fraud. Now let's talk about what the industry actually knew. Privately, during all the years, it was publicly insisting the science was uncertain. The 1964 Surgeon General's report was a watershed, officially titled Smoking and Health, Report of the Advisory Committee to the Surgeon General of the Public Health Service. It drew on over 7,000 research articles, involved 10 distinguished scientists from multiple disciplines, and concluded in language that was unambiguous that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. It was the most comprehensive official review of the evidence to date. It was, by the standards of public health science, as close to definitive as such a document gets. The tobacco industry responded to the 1964 Surgeon General's report by intensifying, not moderating, its campaign of manufactured doubt. The Turk was restructured and renamed the Council for Tobacco Research, partly to create the impression of a new and more serious operation, partly to give the lawyers who now dominated its direction a fresh institutional identity to work with. The Special Projects Program was established specifically in the aftermath of the 1964 report, designed to produce the scientific counter-narrative that the report had made more urgently necessary. Inside the companies, meanwhile, the documents told a different story. In 1963, 1 year before the Surgeon General's report, in the same period that the companies were publicly insisting the science was uncertain, an executive at Brown Williamson named Addison Yeaman wrote a memo. Yeaman was not a scientist. He was a lawyer, the company's general counsel. His memo was not about research, strategy, or litigation planning. It was a frank, internal assessment of the company's situation. Yeaman wrote, "Nicotine is addictive. We are, then, in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug." He continued, with the dry precision of a lawyer describing a problem, the company faced growing pressure from scientific evidence. The evidence was real. The connection between smoking and disease was, in his assessment, genuine. The question was how to manage this situation. What Yeaman was describing, in his corporate lawyer's prose, was a company that privately acknowledged the two facts it was publicly denying, that nicotine was addictive, and that its products caused disease. His memo was internal. It was never intended for public consumption. It was filed in the company's records, where it remained for 30 years, until a paralegal named Brown Williamson extracted it along with thousands of other documents, and it eventually found its way to a congressional subcommittee. Williams is worth pausing on, because his story is a case study in the specific risks that attach to knowing inconvenient things in proximity to organizations with strong incentives to keep them secret. Brown Williamson was not a lawyer. He was a part-time academic, a former theater professor who took a job in the 1980s with a law firm in Louisville, Kentucky, called Wyatt, Tarrant, and Combs, which had Brown Williamson as a major client. His job was to review and organize Brown Williamson's internal documents, a routine document management task in preparation for litigation. In the course of doing this work, Williams read things. He read the 1963 Yeaman memo. He read documents showing that the company had known, for decades, that its products were addictive and harmful. He read documents describing the internal research that confirmed the cancer link. He read, in other words, the private record, the record that contradicted everything the company was saying in public. And then he started making copies. This was, clearly and unambiguously, a violation of his employment agreement, and almost certainly illegal under various confidentiality and property laws. Williams was not a whistleblower in the formal legal sense at this point. He was a man who had read things he wasn't supposed to share, had decided those things needed to be shared, and had taken documents that were not his to take. His motivations appear to have been a mixture of genuine moral outrage, and he was also going through significant personal and financial difficulties, something less purely idealistic. The law has complicated feelings about whistleblowers who operate this way, and the law made those feelings known to Williams in due course. But before it did, the documents reached Congress. The 1994 congressional hearing on tobacco products was, by any measure, a remarkable piece of theater. On April 1994, the chief executive officers of the 7 largest tobacco companies in the United States sat in a row before the House Subcommittee on Health and the Environment, chaired by Representative Henry Waxman of California, and raised their right hands and swore to tell the truth. 7 men, the most powerful executives in one of the most profitable industries in America. All of them, in the weeks leading up to the hearing, had received legal preparation from teams of lawyers who had spent decades managing the specific set of facts that was about to be placed in front of them. The hearing lasted 7 hours. For 7 hours, the 7 executives answered questions from members of Congress about what their companies knew, when they knew it, and what they had told the public. The pivotal exchange came from a relatively junior member of the subcommittee, Representative Ron Wyden of Oregon, who would later become a senator. Wyden had noticed, reviewing the transcript of the witnesses' opening statements, that each of them had touched on the question of nicotine, but none of them had stated their position directly. He decided to ask directly. He went down the row. Do you believe nicotine is not addictive? William Campbell, President and CEO of Philip Morris USA. I believe nicotine is not addictive. Yes. James Johnston, Chairman and CEO of R.J. Reynolds. Cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definition of addiction. There is no intoxication. Joseph Tadeo, President of U.S. Tobacco. I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive. Andrew Tisch, Chairman and CEO of Lorillard. I believe that nicotine is not addictive. Edward Horrigan, Chairman and CEO of Liggett. I believe that nicotine is not addictive. Thomas Sandefur, Chairman and CEO of Brown Williamson. I believe that nicotine is not addictive. Donald Johnston, President and CEO of American Tobacco. And I believe that nicotine is not addictive. 7 men, 7 sworn statements, all of them saying, under oath, before Congress, that nicotine was not addictive. 3 decades earlier, in 1963, Brown and Williamson's own general counsel had written in an internal memo, nicotine is addictive. We are, then, in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug. A Philip Morris researcher named William Dunn had written in an internal 1972 paper the phrase that became one of the most quoted lines from the subsequently disclosed documents, without nicotine, there would be no smoking. The same Dunn, in an internal memo on a related subject, had noted with dry professional concern, do we really want to tout cigarette smoke as a drug? It is. Of course. He then considered the FDA implications of public acknowledgement of this fact and, evidently, concluded that the answer was no. They did not want to. Another internal Philip Morris document from a 1972 research conference stated simply, without nicotine, there would be no smoking. These documents were not public in April 1994. They were inside the company's files, or inside law firm document repositories, or inside the Brown and Williamson archive that Merrill Williams had been quietly copying for years. The 7 executives sitting in the row before the congressional subcommittee knew or should have known, or their legal teams certainly knew that documents existed within their own organizations that directly contradicted the statements they were making under oath. They made the statements anyway. The image of the 7 CEOs in a row, raising their right hands, swearing to tell the truth, and then each in turn telling Congress that they believed nicotine was not addictive. This image became one of the most widely reproduced in the history of the tobacco litigation. It was called, in the press, the 7 Dwarfs moment. It was, by any measure, a public relations catastrophe for the industry, not immediately, but in retrospect. Once the documents that contradicted it became public, because once those documents were public, the 1,994 testimony did not look like a good faith disagreement about scientific definitions. It looked like perjury, which, for several of the executives involved, it arguably was. None of them faced criminal prosecution for it. The legal and political obstacles to prosecuting corporate executives for congressional testimony were, in practice, prohibitive. But none of them remained in their positions for long after the documents emerged. The documents emerged through several channels, almost simultaneously. Merrill Williams' copies of the Brown and Williamson files eventually reached Mississippi Attorney General Mike Moore, who had filed the first of the state-level lawsuits against the tobacco industry. Moore shared them with Congress. Brown and Williamson's response to this development was instructive. The company filed a lawsuit against Williams for theft of its documents, and subpoenaed the 2 congressional representatives who had received them, Waxman and Wyden, in a Kentucky state court, seeking to compel the members of Congress to return the documents and submit to deposition. This audacious legal move, a corporation suing sitting members of Congress for receiving documents, was eventually shut down by federal intervention. But it illustrated, with admirable clarity, what the industry's priorities were: not correcting the record, not acknowledging what the documents said, getting the documents back. The other channel was Jeffrey Wigand. Wigand was not a paralegal. He was a senior executive vice president for research and development at Brown and Williamson. With a PhD in biochemistry, he was, in other words, one of the people who actually knew what the science said from the inside, and what the company had done with that knowledge. He had left Brown and Williamson in 1993, under circumstances that were acrimonious and included a non-disclosure agreement with financial penalties for violations. In February 1996, Wiggins sat down for an interview with the television program 60 Minutes on CBS. The interview, and the legal and corporate battle that surrounded it. CBS initially refused to air the full version of the interview under threat of litigation from Brown and Williamson, before eventually airing it, became the subject of a 1,999 film. The Insider, starring Russell Crowe as Wigand and Al Pacino as the 60 Minutes producer Lowell Bergman. The film is, by the standards of docudramas, reasonably accurate. It captured something true about the specific courage it required, in the mid-1990s, to publicly contradict an industry with the resources and the demonstrated willingness to destroy individuals who became inconvenient. What Wigand told 60 Minutes, and then told in sworn depositions in subsequent litigation, included specific details about Brown and Williamson's internal research and its deliberate concealment. He described the company's knowledge of nicotine's addictive properties. He described the manipulation of nicotine levels in cigarettes to maintain addiction. He described the atmosphere inside the company toward the science, the specific, deliberate, institutionalized practice of not acknowledging, internally, what the research was showing, because acknowledging it would create legal liability. He described, in other words, the gap between the private knowledge and the public performance, the same gap that the 1,963 Yemen Memo had revealed, and that the 1,969 doubt is our product Memo had described as industry strategy. By the mid-1990s, that gap was closing. Not quickly enough. Not before an enormous amount of additional preventable damage had been done. But the documents were out. The whistleblowers were talking. The state attorneys general was suing. And the elaborate construction of manufactured uncertainty that the industry had spent 4 decades building was beginning. At last, to show the cracks, the CTR's annual budget had grown from $948, 151 inches 1,954 to more than $20 million in its final year of operation in 1997. By the time it was dissolved as a condition of the Master Settlement Agreement in 1998, it had by its own accounting, more than $302 million in total grants since its founding, producing, it proudly noted, more than 400 scientifiques publications, 6,400 publications, in legitimate journals, by researchers who had received funding from an organization whose primary purpose was to prevent those publications from adding up to a policy response. The math is impressive. In a grim sort of way. Over $300 million. Over 44 years. To maintain the appearance of scientific controversy. It was, as the Brown and Williamson General Counsel had noted in an internal memo, the best and cheapest insurance the tobacco industry can buy. Cheapest. Relative to what? Relative to the alternative. Acknowledging. In 1954. And what their own researchers had already told them. Acknowledging it in 1954 would have meant regulatory action, legal liability, and potentially the end of the most profitable consumer product in American history. The 400 million people who smoked American cigarettes between 1954 and 1998, and the 100 million who died from it were, from the industry's perspective, the market that the insurance was protecting. The CTR is gone now, dissolved by court order, et document in archive, and its history dissected in academic papers and legal judgments. The specific machinery of the Turk and CTR era will not be replicated in that form. But the playbook, it developed the strategy of manufacturing scientific doubt, funding skeptical researchers, creating the appearance of controversy, and using attorney-client privilege to shield the operation from scrutiny. This playbook was not buried with the CTR. It was, by the time the CTR was dissolved, already in use elsewhere. The fossil fuel industry was using it, had been using it, in some cases, since the 1970s, with some of the same public relations firms and some of the same strategies. The chemical industry was using it. The sugar industry had used it decades earlier, funding research that redirected public health concerns away from sugar and toward dietary fat. A story that would emerge fully only in the 2010s when those internal documents were also discovered. The tobacco industry's contribution to the history of public misinformation is not just the specific lie it told about its specific product. It is the institutional template, the proof of concept that a well-funded, well-organized campaign of manufactured scientific uncertainty could, for decades, keep a public from understanding something that the people running the campaign understood perfectly well. They built the institute. They ran it for 44 years. They spent over $300 million doing it. And when the institute was finally closed and its documents were finally opened, the industry's own internal files confirmed everything that the public health community had been saying since 1950. The science had been right all along. The Turk had known the science was right all along. Its entire reason for existing was to prevent that knowledge from becoming policy. It succeeded. For 44 years. While the science was being systematically dismissed as uncertain. Approximately 1 billion people worldwide were smoking cigarettes. The WHO estimates that in the 20th century, tobacco killed 100 million of them. The Turk staff won no scientific prizes, but on the specific metric it was designed to optimize the delay between scientific knowledge and public health policy, it was, by any objective measure, extraordinarily effective. Here is the problem with manufacturing scientific doubt. It requires scientists, not just public relations professionals, not just lawyers, not just executives making budget decisions in boardrooms. You need actual scientists, people with actual credentials, actual affiliation, actual publication records to stand up and say that the science is uncertain. Because if the doubt is being manufactured solely by people in suits who make their living selling cigarettes, nobody will believe it. The operation only works if the people doing the doubting look like scientists. This created, for the tobacco industry, a specific kind of talent acquisition challenge. The mainstream scientific community was, by the late 1960s and certainly by the 1970s, largely in agreement on the smoking cancer question. The epidemiological evidence was overwhelming. The Surgeon General had spoken. The major medical associations had spoken. The Royal College of Physicians had spoken. The scientific consensus was not absolute. No scientific consensus ever is, but it was, by any reasonable measure, the kind of consensus that justifies policy action. This meant that the pool of credible scientists who genuinely, in good faith, believed the science was uncertain, was small, and getting smaller. The industry needed scientists who were willing to publicly represent uncertainty that did not, in most cases, represent their own private assessment of the evidence. Some of these scientists were found through the CTR grant system, researchers whose work touched on areas adjacent to the cancer question and who, when approached to serve as advisors or public spokespersons, were willing to discuss the complexity of the evidence in ways that served the industry's narrative. But the most important scientists, the ones whose names and credentials gave the doubt operation its highest value assets, came from a different and, in hindsight, a deeply revealing source. They came from the Cold War physics establishment. This is not an obvious connection. The relationship between cigarette manufacturing and nuclear weapons research does not suggest itself as a natural one. But in the history of how the tobacco industry maintained its campaign of manufactured doubt from the 1970s through the 1990s, the Cold War physicists are central figures, and understanding why requires understanding something about the specific ideology that animated them. The physicists who became the tobacco industry's most prominent scientific allies were, almost without exception, men who had made their careers in the defense-related sciences of the Cold War era. They had worked on nuclear weapons. They had worked on missile defense. They had been deeply embedded in the security state. And they shared, to a degree that became professionally defining in their later careers, a specific worldview, a deep, passionate, almost religious commitment to free market capitalism, a corresponding hostility to government regulation of any kind, and a conviction which they did not always distinguish carefully from scientific conclusions that environmentalists and public health researchers were, in various ways, tools of communist subversion, or at minimum dangerous expansions of government authority. This worldview is important because it explains something that otherwise seems puzzling. Why distinguish scientists, men with genuine credentials, genuine publication records, genuine achievements in their actual fields, would be willing to publicly misrepresent the state of evidence on questions outside their expertise? The tobacco industry did not, in most cases, need to pay these men to change their opinions. It needed to find men whose opinions were already in the right place for ideological reasons, and give them a platform and a funding stream. The most important of these scientists was Frederick Seitz. Seitz's biography is, by any measure, genuinely distinguished. He was a physicist, a real one, a serious one. He had worked on the Manhattan Project. He had pioneered the field of solid-state physics. He had served as president of the United States National Academy of Sciences from 1962 to 1969, arguably the most prestigious position in American academic science. He was later president of Rockefeller University. He was a recipient of the National Medal of Science. These were not honorary credentials. Frederick Seitz had, through decades of legitimate scientific work, become one of the most credentialed scientists in the United States. In 1979, he took a consulting contract with R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. Reynolds put Seitz in charge of a $45 million biomedical research grant program. Over the 6 years that he ran it from 1979 to 1985, Seitz distributed these funds to researchers around the country. The research program was publicly presented as a commitment to serious biomedical science, and indeed, some genuine science was funded through it. Research on cardiovascular disease, on cancer biology, on neurological conditions. Reynolds ran advertisements in newspapers and magazines, citing the multi-million-dollar program as proof of its commitment to science. In 1981, Big Tobacco directed $6.3 million to this program, compared to $300,000 that the American Cancer Society and the American Lung Association together contributed to cancer research in the same year. The industry was, at least numerically, outspending the public health organizations by more than 20 to 1. But there was a specific, documented constraint on what the $45 million could fund. Seitz himself, in a later interview, described it with disarming candor. They didn't want us looking at the health effects of cigarette smoking. The program was designed to fund science that could generate credible-looking credentials for witnesses who might be useful in court and in public debate, not to investigate the central question that everyone involved privately knew was already answered. It was, in the words of an R.J. Reynolds internal document from 1979, designed to develop an extensive body of scientifically well-grounded data, useful in defending the industry against attacks. Note the precise phrasing. Not develop an extensive body of scientifically well-grounded data, useful in understanding the health effects of the product. Useful in defending. The research program existed not to find out what was true, but to produce material useful in arguing against what was already true. Seitz earned approximately $585,000 for his consulting work with Reynolds. According to company documents, he later admitted that the research he oversaw deliberately steered clear of the smoking health question. He went on, after his tobacco work, to become one of the founding figures of climate change denial, applying the same strategy of manufactured uncertainty to the question of human-caused global warming. Using the same tactics, sometimes working with the same PR firms. By 1989, an internal Philip Morris document describes Seitz then in his late 70s as quite elderly and not sufficiently rational to offer advice. The industry had moved on from its specific use of Seitz, but the machinery he had helped build and the credibility he had lent to the doubt operation during its most important years had served their purpose. The other major figure in the intersection of tobacco industry doubt and Cold War physics was S. Frelsinger. Singer was, like Seitz, a genuine scientist, a physicist who had made real contributions to his field, had served as the first director of the National Weather Satellite Service, and had held a position as chief scientist at the Department of Transportation in the Reagan administration. He was, by any normal measure, a credentialed expert. In the mid-1990s, Singer co-authored a major report attacking the Environmental Protection Agency's assessment of the health risks of secondhand smoke, the environmental tobacco smoke or ETS issue. The EPA had, in 1992, classified environmental tobacco smoke as a known human carcinogen, Group A, the same category as asbestos and benzene. This finding was based on a comprehensive review of the epidemiological evidence by a panel of leading researchers. Singer attacked it, claiming the work was methodologically flawed and that the EPA review had been distorted by a political agenda. Singer's report was funded by a grant from the Tobacco Institute, but the funding was channeled through a think tank called the Alexis de Tocqueville Institution, in a manner specifically designed to obscure the tobacco industry's role. The report appeared to come from an independent research organization. It did not appear to come from the Tobacco Institute. This was not accidental. It was the same basic structure as the CTR special projects. The real funding source hidden behind an institutional intermediary that provided the appearance of independence. The ETS campaign is worth dwelling on because it represents the tobacco industry's most ambitious expansion of the doubt strategy beyond the direct health effects of smoking into the question of secondhand smoke. And the ETS campaign is significant for reasons that go beyond tobacco. Because it was in running the ETS campaign that the tobacco industry developed a new institutional mechanism that it would later hand off to other industries. The mechanism was the fake grassroots organization. In the early 1990s, Philip Morris was facing a specific regulatory problem. The EPA's secondhand smoke classification was creating pressure for workplace smoking restrictions and indoor air quality regulations that would significantly affect where cigarettes could be smoked, and therefore how many cigarettes would be smoked. Philip Morris needed to fight the EPA classification, but it needed to fight it in a way that didn't look like a cigarette company fighting regulation. Because a cigarette company fighting regulation is not a sympathetic protagonist. Philip Morris hired a consulting firm called APCO Associates. APCO's proposal, preserved in the subsequently released tobacco documents, was to create an organization that would look like a broad coalition of citizens concerned about government overreach in science, but would in practice be directed and funded by Philip Morris. The organization would recruit scientists, economists, journalists, and policy advocates to argue against what APCO's documents called junk science, a term that in APCO's usage meant any scientific finding that supported regulation, regardless of its actual quality. The organization was called the Advancement of Sound Science Coalition, DUSC, as it was abbreviated. Its stated mission was to oppose junk science and regulatory policy. Its actual mission, as documented in the internal Philip Morris files, was to manufacture credible-looking opposition to the EPA's secondhand smoke finding and, more broadly, to any scientific finding that supported government regulation. DUSC hired Singer and Zeitz. It recruited scientists from various disciplines, not necessarily scientists with any expertise in the specific questions they were being asked to opine on. The selection criterion was not expertise. It was willingness to publicly question scientific findings that the regulatory apparatus was using as a basis for action. The Philip Morris documents reveal something remarkable about the scope of what APCO was proposing. The organization, they suggested, should not limit itself to tobacco. It should position itself as a broad defender of sound science against regulatory overreach across multiple industries and issues, making it harder to identify as a tobacco industry front, and more useful as a template for other industries facing similar problems. The documents explicitly noted that if TASC were identified as a tobacco industry creation, its credibility would be destroyed. The solution was to make it genuinely multi-issue, an organization that fought junk science in all its forms, that happened to be funded primarily by tobacco. This was, in retrospect, one of the more consequential innovations in the history of corporate disinformation. TASC and the template it established were the model for a network of think tanks, advocacy organizations, and sound science coalitions that would, over the following decades, challenge the scientific basis of environmental regulations, food safety rules, pharmaceutical safety requirements, and climate policy using tactics, personnel, and in some cases literally the same public relations firms that had been developed in the tobacco campaigns. Steve Malloy, Task's first director, previously of APCO, went on to run the website Junk Science.com, which became one of the most prominent platforms for contrarian takes on environmental and health science, eventually expanding to cover climate change denial. Singer went on to found the Science and Environmental Policy Project, which became a leading climate skeptic organization. Seitz helped found the George C. Marshall Institute, which became, in the words of a 2007 Union of Concerned Scientists report, a clearinghouse for global warming contrarians. The tobacco strategy, in other words, did not end with tobacco. It reproduced the personnel, the institutional templates, the rhetorical techniques, and in some cases the actual funding networks that had been developed to cast doubt on the smoking cancer link were repurposed, with minimal modification, to cast doubt on other scientific findings that other industries found inconvenient. This is the thing that makes the tobacco story something more than the story of a specific industry's bad behavior. It is the story of an epistemological technology, a set of techniques for manufacturing public uncertainty about scientific findings that was developed in the tobacco context and then transferred to the broader economy of industrial-scale doubt. The scientists who participated in this transfer were not, in most cases, stupid people. They were not uninformed. Several of them were, in their own fields, genuine experts with genuine records of achievement. What they were was ideologically committed to a view of government regulation as inherently dangerous, to a view of environmentalism as a form of collectivism incompatible with free markets, to a view in which any scientific finding that supported regulatory action was, almost by definition, suspect. This ideology made them useful to industries that needed credentialed scientists willing to publicly dispute findings that most of the scientific community accepted. And it made them, in some important cases, genuinely willing to provide that service, not simply because they were being paid for it, though they were, but because they believed in the larger project of which their specific work was a part. The tobacco industry found them, funded them, and deployed them. And when the tobacco strategy was over, when the Master Settlement Agreement in 1998 finally forced the industry to acknowledge publicly what its own documents had been saying privately, for 50 years the scientists who had been trained in the tobacco doubt operation were still active, still credentialed, still deployable, and were already at work on other campaigns. Now let's talk about the thing that eventually broke the strategy open and why it took as long as it did. The tobacco industry's manufactured doubt campaign succeeded for as long as it did for several reasons. And understanding those reasons is important because they are not unique to tobacco. First, the strategy exploited a genuine feature of how science communicates. Science always has uncertainty in it. Every study has limitations. Every finding is subject to replication, raffinement, and revision. This is not a weakness of science, it is how science works. But it creates a vulnerability to a specific kind of attack, the attack that takes the genuine, inherent uncertainty of any individual study and presents it as evidence that the broader question is unresolved. The tobacco strategy did not manufacture uncertainty about any specific study. It manufactured uncertainty about the entire body of evidence by pointing, selectively and persistently, to the genuine uncertainties that existed in specific parts of it. This worked because most people, including journalists, including policymakers, including the general public, are not trained in how to evaluate the cumulative weight of scientific evidence. They are trained to notice that scientists disagree, or that studies have limitations, or that more research is needed. The tobacco industry's message, "the science is uncertain," mapped onto these intuitions in a way that was hard to counter without a lengthy explanation of how epidemiological evidence accumulates and what consensus actually means in science. Second, the strategy exploited the norms of journalism. Journalism in the mid-20th century operated under what was sometimes called the fairness or objectivity norm, the principle that responsible reporting presented both sides of a contested question. This norm made sense in the context of genuinely contested political or social questions, where there really are two or more legitimate perspectives. It made much less sense in the context of a scientific question where the evidence had, by any reasonable measure, produced a clear answer. But the tobacco industry's manufactured controversy looked, on the surface, like a genuine scientific controversy, and the journalism norms of the era required that its apparent other side be represented. The result was decades of newspaper and magazine coverage that, in dutifully presenting both sides, presented a false picture of the state of scientific opinion. An article that interviewed a mainstream epidemiologist who believed smoking caused cancer, and then, in the interest of balance, interviewed a CTR-funded researcher who expressed doubt about the certainty of the evidence. This article was following normal journalistic practice. It was also producing exactly the impression the tobacco industry had designed and funded the doubt operation to produce, the impression that this was a live scientific debate. Third, the strategy exploited the specific social position of scientists. Scientists have authority in modern society precisely because they are expected to follow the evidence rather than their interests. When a scientist expresses a view, the default assumption is that the view reflects genuine assessment of evidence. The tobacco industry found scientists who were willing to express views that did not reflect genuine assessment of evidence, who were willing, for ideological or financial reasons, to publicly represent a position that their own private knowledge and the broader scientific consensus did not support. This exploitation of scientific authority was, in retrospect, the most damaging element of the entire campaign. The cigarette company executive saying our product is safe could be discounted as self-interested. The former president of the National Academy of Sciences saying the evidence is uncertain could not be discounted as easily, even though in the specific case of Frederick Seitz, it was equally self-interested and equally disconnected from what the evidence actually showed. By the late 1990s, as the Master Settlement Agreement negotiations were proceeding and the internal documents were becoming public, the full architecture of the scientific doubt operation was becoming visible. The researchers began documenting it systematically. Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway, science historians at Harvard and Caltech, respectively spent years tracing the connections between the tobacco doubt operation and the subsequent campaigns on acid rain, the ozone hole, and climate change. Their 2010 book, Merchants of Doubt, is the most comprehensive account of how the personnel and techniques migrated from tobacco to other industries. It made for reading that was, for anyone who had assumed that scientific controversy was generally the product of genuine scientific disagreement, fairly uncomfortable. The documented connections were not metaphorical. They were literal. The same people, the same organizations, sometimes the same PR firms, sometimes, as with the task template, explicitly designed with transfer to other industries in mind. The tobacco industry did not just tell a lie about its product. It developed and funded and staffed a system for telling lies that looked like scientific truth, and when the system was built and tested and proven effective, other industries noticed and borrowed the blueprints. The scientists who built it, who lent their credentials to a campaign whose purpose they understood, who stood up at press conferences and in congressional testimony and in op-ed pages and said the science was uncertain when they knew, or should have known, that it was not. These scientists are, in a specific and serious sense, authors of a methodology. Their contribution to the intellectual history of public misinformation is not as perpetrators of a fraud that could not be replicated. It is as developers of a technique that has been replicated many times, with consequences that continue to accumulate. In 2006, United States District Judge Gladys Kessler issued her ruling in the federal government's racketeering case against the tobacco companies. She found that the defendants had, for decades, engaged in a massive 50-year scheme to defraud the public, including smokers and potential smokers, about the devastating health effects of smoking and ETS, the addictive nature of nicotine, and defendants' ongoing manipulation of cigarette design and composition to sustain nicotine addiction. A scheme to defraud, not negligence, not good faith disagreement. A scheme to defraud, and within that scheme, the scientific doubt operation, the Turk, the CTR, the special projects, the hired skeptics, the front organizations. The channeled funding was the most sophisticated element. It was sophisticated because it used the authority of science to undermine the findings of science. It was, in Judge Kessler's characterization, fraude, but it was fraud that required, for its most effective operation, people with PhDs. The documents from the tobacco litigation are now archived and publicly accessible at the UCSF Truth Tobacco Industry Documents Library, more than 14 million pages, searchable online. The most comprehensive archive of corporate internal documents relating to public health fraud ever compiled. They contain the memos and the grant decisions and the strategy documents and the personnel files that show, in exhaustive detail, how the scientific doubt operation was designed, funded, and run. They are public because the litigation forced them to be public. For 40 years before that, they were secret. And during those 40 years, the doubt they were designed to manufacture did what manufactured doubt does. It delayed action. It prevented policy. It kept people smoking. And it kept the body count climbing. The scientists who participated knew, or should have known, what they were participating in. The historian who eventually documented it most thoroughly, Robert Proctor of Stanford, whose book Golden Holocaust is the definitive account of the tobacco catastrophe, developed a term for the study of how ignorance is produced and maintained, agnotology, the study of ignorance as a manufactured product, a thing that is made, that has architects and funders and staff. The Tobacco Doubt campaign was the first fully industrialized application of agnotology. The scientists it recruited were its most essential workers, not because they discovered new truths, but because they gave manufactured ignorance a credential. On November 23, 1998, in Washington, D.C., the Attorneys General of 46 American states signed an agreement with the 4 largest tobacco companies in the United States. The agreement was called the Tobacco Master Settlement Agreement. Its financial terms were, at the time, the largest civil litigation settlement in American history. The 4 tobacco companies, Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, Brown Williamson, and Lorillard, agreed to pay the settling states a minimum of $206 billion over the first 25 years, with payments continuing in perpetuity for as long as cigarettes were sold in the United States. The total projected payment over time was estimated at somewhere between $206 billion and $246 billion. Depending on sales, volumes, and other adjustment factors, $206 billion. Let that number sit for a moment, not as an abstraction, but as a measure. It is a measure of what 44 years of manufactured doubt, deployed at industrial scale, against a public health finding that the industry's own researchers had confirmed in the 1950s, cost the American healthcare system. It is the amount that state governments had spent treating the lung cancers, the heart diseases, the emphysema, the strokes, the dozens of other conditions that decades of smoking had produced in the populations. Those governments were responsible for the medical bills that accrued, while the doubt campaign was successfully preventing the policy response that the science had been calling for since 1950. The settlement required, in addition to the financial payments, that the four companies disband the Tobacco Institute, the Center for Indoor Air Research, and the Council for Tobacco Research, the organizational infrastructure of the manufactured doubt operation. It required restrictions on advertising, particularly advertising that targeted minors. It required the creation of the Truth Initiative, an anti-smoking advocacy organization funded by the settlement. And it required something else, something that, in terms of its long-term historical significance, may matter more than all the money. It required the tobacco companies to make their internal documents public. More than 40 million pages of previously confidential internal documents, accumulated over decades of litigation discovery, were to be posted to a publicly accessible website and maintained for ongoing public scrutiny. The documents from Philip Morris, Reynolds, Brown and Williamson, Lorillard, the Council for Tobacco Research, and the Tobacco Institute, the memos and the strategy papers and the internal research reports and the grant records and the legal correspondence, all of it public. The University of California, San Francisco established what is now called the Truth Tobacco Industry Documents Library, a searchable online archive that currently contains over 14 million documents and continues to be researched by public health scientists, historians, and journalists worldwide. It is one of the most consequential archives of corporate wrongdoing ever assembled. It is the archive from which David King documented the scale of Soviet photo manipulation Ice Wrong series. It is the archive from which Alan Brandt documented the machinery of the Frank Statement, from which Robert Proctor documented the breadth of what he called the tobacco catastrophe, from which Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway traced the migration of the doubt strategy from tobacco to climate science. The documents do not lie. They cannot be retouched or replaced. They are, in the most literal sense, what actually happened, written down, in real time, by the people doing it, for internal audiences who had no reason to pretend. They are the private record that the public performance was designed to conceal, and when you read them alongside the public record, the Frank Statement, the CTR press releases, the congressional testimony, newspaper advertisements, the gap between what the industry knew and what it said is as clear and as damning as anything in the modern history of corporate conduct. But here is the thing that the Master Settlement Agreement and the document disclosure did not do. They did not fix the problem retroactively. The settlement was signed in November 1998. Richard Dahl and Bradford Hill had published their first study, linking smoking and lung cancer, in September 1950. Between those two dates, 48 years, the cigarette companies had continued selling cigarettes. American smokers had continued smoking. The doubt campaign had continued working, and people had continued dying. Let's talk about the numbers, not as statistics, as an accounting. In the 20th century, tobacco killed approximately 100 million people worldwide. This is the estimate from the World Health Organization, from the Centers for Disease Control, from the researchers at Our World in Data, who have compiled the most comprehensive global mortality statistics available. 100 million people, more than the combined death tolls of World War I, the 1918 influenza pandemic, and World War II. 100 million in the United States alone. The CDC estimates that cigarette smoking causes more than 480,000 deaths per year, about 1 in 5 of all American deaths annually. By any measure, it is the leading cause of preventable death in the country. The word preventable in that sentence is doing a great deal of work. It means these deaths were not inevitable. They were the product of a choice, billions of individual choices. Certainly, but also a systemic choice, made in a boardroom in December 1953, to prevent the information that would have changed many of those individual choices from reaching the people who needed it. How many of those 100 million 20th century tobacco deaths are attributable specifically to the Doubt campaign? How many people continued smoking because the Frank Statement and its successors convinced them that the science was uncertain? People who would have quit or never started if the evidence had been communicated honestly? This is not a question that can be answered with the precision of an accounting ledger. The counterfactual, what would have happened if, in 1954, the tobacco industry had publicly acknowledged what its own researchers were telling it is, by definition, something that didn't happen. And we cannot perfectly model what it would have produced, but we can look at what happened when information was communicated honestly. The 1964 Surgeon General's report, the first official, authoritative public statement that smoking caused lung cancer, produced a measurable change in behavior. Per capita cigarette consumption in the United States had been rising steeply through the late 1950s and early 1960s, driven by the effective suppression of the health evidence and the continued effectiveness of tobacco advertising. After the 1964 report, it began, for the first time in decades, to fall, slowly at first, then fester, as the evidence accumulated and the social norms began to shift. By 2019, U.S. cigarette consumption had dropped by more than 50% from its 1,998 levels. The 1964 report was published 10 years after the Frank Statement, 10 years in which the Frank Statement and the Doubt operation it inaugurated had kept the official scientific consensus from being communicated to the public with the clarity that the Surgeon General eventually provided. 10 years of continued, growing cigarette sales. 10 years of lung cancer rates still rising, while the industry spent its public communication budget insisting the science was unresolved. Those 10 years, from 1954 to 1964, represent a specific, bounded period in which we know the Doubt campaign was working. We know people were continuing to smoke, partly because the evidence had been obscured, and we know what the trajectory of smoking-related disease was during that period. The lung cancer death rate in American men, which had been climbing steeply since the 1940s, continued to climb through the 1950s and into the early 1960s. It would not peak until the 1990s, 3 decades after the Surgeon General's report, because lung cancer develops over decades of smoking exposure, and the men dying of it in the 1990s were the men who had been smoking in the 1950s, during the years when the Doubt campaign was most effective. This is the specific, documented, biological mechanism by which the manufactured doubt killed people. It was not that people read the Frank Statement and immediately lit a cigarette that gave them lung cancer. It was that people read the Frank Statement and continued a habit that they would, at various points, have been more likely to quit if the information had been honest, and that the cancer from that continued habit and developed over the following 30 years and killed them in middle age. The tobacco companies knew this mechanism. They had the data. Their own researchers were tracking the epidemiology. The 1963 Yemen Memo: nicotine is addictive. We are in the business of selling nicotine. An addictive drug was written by a man who understood exactly what the product did and what keeping people using it meant in human terms. He wrote it down in a memo and filed it. The memo was secret for 30 years. Now let's talk about what happened after 1998. Because the Master Settlement Agreement and the disclosure of the documents did not end the tobacco story, not in the United States, and certainly not globally. In the United States, cigarette consumption declined substantially after the settlement. The combination of higher prices, the industry passed, the settlement costs to consumers through price increases, restricted advertising, anti-smoking campaigns funded partly by settlement money, and the growing public awareness of the industry's documented misconduct produced a genuine shift. Smoking rates among American adults fell from roughly 24% in 1998 to under 12% by the early 2020s. The high school smoking rate fell from its near peak of 36% in 1997 to around 6% in 2019. These are genuine, meaningful public health improvements. Real people are alive today who would not be alive if smoking rates had remained at their late 20th century levels. But the tobacco companies did not stop selling cigarettes. They could not be required to stop selling cigarettes. That was never part of the settlement. The $206 billion was compensation for past harm, not an end to future harm. The companies continued to manufacture and sell a product that, as of the early 2020s, still kills more than 480,000 Americans per year and 8 million people worldwide per year. The settlement bought accountability for the past. It did not buy prevention for the future. And globally, and the story is considerably darker. The doubt campaign that American tobacco companies developed and deployed in the United States was not limited to the United States. The same companies, through their international subsidiaries, and through the international coordinating structure that Operation Berkshire had established in the late 1970s, applied the same strategies, the same manufactured doubt, the same front organizations, the same funding of skeptical researchers, the same lobbying against regulation in markets around the world. In many of those markets, particularly in low and middle-income countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the campaign was considerably more effective and considerably longer-lived, because the regulatory and legal infrastructure that eventually constrained the industry in the United States did not exist or was much weaker. The projections for the 21st century are, as a result, significantly worse than the 20th century record. The WHO estimates that if current patterns persist, tobacco will kill approximately 1 billion people in the 21st century. 1 billion, 10 times the 20th century total. The epicenter of this projection is not the United States or Western Europe, where smoking rates are declining. It is China, India, Indonesia, and the developing world more broadly, markets where American and British and Japanese tobacco companies spent decades investing in distribution, infrastructure, and brand building, in some cases working actively to undermine domestic regulatory capacity. The Master Settlement Agreement did not reach those markets. The 40 million documents that are now publicly accessible did not change the regulatory environment in China. The Truth Initiative does not run advertising campaigns in Indonesia. The accountability that American litigation eventually produced was geographically circumscribed. The harm was not. This is not a counsel of despair. There is genuine progress. The WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, adopted in 2003 and now ratified by 182 countries, represents the world's first international public health treaty, specifically targeting a consumer product. Smoking rates are declining in most countries, including many developing ones. The tools that work: taxation, comprehensive advertising bans, plain packaging, public smoking restrictions. Cessation support are now well understood and increasingly implemented. The science that the tobacco industry spent 44 years and more than $300 million trying to manufacture doubt about is now, globally and unambiguously, settled. But the lesson of the tobacco story is not primarily about tobacco. It is about what happens when a powerful industry decides that the most profitable response to inconvenient scientific truth is to manufacture the appearance of uncertainty about it. It is about the specific, sophisticated, institutional mechanisms that were developed to do this: the front organizations, the funded skeptics, the attorney-client privilege shields, the strategic deployment of scientific credentials for non-scientific purposes. It is about the specific vulnerability of democratic societies to this kind of operation. Because democratic societies make decisions through public debate, and public debate can be corrupted by the systematic injection of false controversy. And it is about the question that hangs over every subsequent industry that has borrowed the tobacco playbook: what does it cost? In human lives and human suffering. To delay the policy response to a scientific finding by 10 years, by 20 years, by 40 years? For tobacco, we have an approximate answer: 100 million dead in the 20th century alone, with the 21st century projections suggesting that the full bill is still being written. For other applications of the tobacco strategy, climate change, where the same tactics have delayed meaningful emissions policy by decades. Certain pharmaceutical applications, where similar strategies obscured safety signals until after irreversible harm had been done. The accounting is still ongoing. The document that changed everything, the Master Settlement Agreement, did not change everything. It changed the specific legal and financial position of 4 American tobacco companies with respect to 46 American states. It produced accountability of a specific and limited kind, for a specific and bounded portion of the harm. It did not undo the harm. It did not reach the harm that continues to accumulate in markets where the accountability did not reach. And it did not, in itself, prevent the methodology from being borrowed and redeployed. The methodology is still in use. The specific PR firms are different. The specific front organizations are new. The specific scientific skeptics are, in some cases, younger than the ones who worked for R. J. Reynolds and Philip Morris. But the structure: fund the doubt, manufacture the controversy, deploy credentialed voices to represent uncertainty that the people deploying them do not privately hold, use attorney-client privilege to shield the operation, wait out the policy clock. This structure was proven effective in the tobacco context, was documented exhaustively in the tobacco litigation, and has been, with relatively modest adaptations, applied to subsequent scientific questions with sufficient inconvenience to warrant the investment. Judge Gladys Kessler, in her 2006 ruling in United States v. St. Philip Morris, wrote that the defendants had engaged in a massive 50-year scheme to defraud the public. She wrote that they had marketed and sold their lethal product with zeal, with deception, with a single-minded focus on their financial interest, and without regard for the human tragedy or social costs that success exacted, without regard for the human tragedy. The 1963 Yemen Memo said nicotine is addictive. We are in the business of selling nicotine, an addictive drug. The 1969 Brown Williamson document said, doubt is our product. The 7 CEOs raised their right hands in 1994 and told Congress, under oath, that they did not believe nicotine was addictive. Frederick Seitz administered $45 million in research grants, specifically designed not to look at the health effects of smoking. The CTR's Special Projects Division spent $18 million over 24 years funding litigation science under attorney-client privilege. The Tobacco Institute produced decades of press releases and media materials citing independent research that was anything but. And while all of this was happening, while the doubt was being manufactured, and the controversy was being seeded, and the scientists were being hired, and the documents were being filed, and the lawyers were being briefed, people were smoking. Millions of them. Hundreds of millions of them. Ordinary people. In ordinary circumstances. Making decisions about their own health with information that had been systematically corrupted by an industry that knew better. They were not, for the most part, stupid. They were not uniquely credulous. They were doing what people do in institutions. They have reason to trust the press. The Scientific Advisory Board. The full-page advertisement in 448 newspapers tell them that the science is uncertain. They waited for the science to become certain. And the industry spent 4 decades and $300 million making sure that waiting felt reasonable. 100 million people. That is the toll of the cigarette that never caused cancer. It always caused cancer. They knew.